I don't keep a diary, but if I did, that Tuesday morning in June would have earned the kind of entry that makes you wonder why you bothered getting out of bed. The brownstone on West 35th Street was running on its usual clockwork. Wolfe upstairs with his orchids from 9 to 11, Fritz in the kitchen performing his daily miracles with ingredients that cost more than most people's rent, and me at my desk pretending that sorting the mail and dodging bill collectors qualified as detective work. The phone had been mercifully quiet, the doorbell hadn't made a peep, and I was beginning to think we might actually have a peaceful day. That should have been my first warning. In our business, peaceful days are like unicorns. Everybody talks about them, but nobody's actually seen one. At 10:47, the doorbell decided to end my brief flirtation with optimism. I opened the door to find a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of one of those magazines that Fritz sometimes leaves lying around the kitchen, the ones with pictures of food so perfect they make you suspicious of your own cooking. She was somewhere in her 40s, with auburn hair pulled back in a way that suggested she didn't have time for nonsense, and she wore a grey wool suit that probably cost more than our monthly grocery bill. More importantly, she was clutching a galley proof against her chest like it contained state secrets. "Mr. Goodwin," she asked, extending a hand that felt like it had spent considerable time wielding editorial pencils. "I'm Lila Vance from Palatine Press. I need to see Mr. Wolfe immediately." "He's engaged until 11, I said, which is the standard response we give to anyone who wants to see Wolfe before his sacred hour. "Would you like to make an appointment?" "This can't wait." She held up the galley. "Someone has put Mr. Wolfe's name in this cookbook without his permission, and if we go to press next week, it's going to cause problems for everyone involved." That got my attention. People use Wolfe's name for a lot of things, usually to add weight to their arguments or credibility to their claims, but they rarely have the nerve to put it in print without asking first. And when they do, Wolfe tends to take it personally. "What kind of cookbook?" I asked, stepping aside to let her in. "Rafe Danton's new one, The Hearth and the Knife." She followed me into the office and took the red leather chair without being invited, which showed either confidence or desperation. "I'm the managing editor. This morning I discovered that someone has altered the acknowledgements page to include a reference to Mr. Wolfe advising on recipe revisions. The problem is, Mr. Wolfe has never worked with us, never met Mr. Danton, and certainly never advised anyone on Chapter 4. I glanced at the clock. 3 minutes to 11. "And you think this was done deliberately?" "I know it was." She opened the galley to a page marked with a yellow ribbon. "Look at this." The original. Acknowledgements thanked various suppliers and assistants. The current version thanks them and then adds, "and to Nero Wolfe, whose incomparable palate advised the revision of Chapter 4. It's been inserted so seamlessly that if I hadn't been checking the final proofs myself, we might have missed it entirely. The elevator cage clanked in the hall, followed by Wolfe's measured footsteps. He appeared in the doorway, surveyed the scene with his usual expression of mild disapproval at finding his office occupied by a stranger, and moved to his desk with the deliberate precision of a man who knows exactly how much weight his chair can support. "Good morning," he said to Miss Vance, settling into his chair. "I understand there's some urgency to your visit." "There is." She turned the galley toward him. "Mr. Wolfe, someone has taken the liberty of including your name in the acknowledgements of a cookbook that's scheduled to go to press next week. I need to know who did it and why." Wolfe picked up the galley and examined the page she'd indicated. His expression didn't change, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that usually means someone has just made a serious mistake. "I have not," he said carefully, "advised anyone on the revision of Chapter 4 of anything, let alone a cookbook by—" He glanced at the cover. "Mr. Rafe Danton." "I was certain you hadn't. But the alteration is so professionally done that it would fool most readers. More troubling, there are other changes throughout the manuscript. Hidden messages, if you will. Someone has been systematically altering the text, embedding codes and references that spell out accusations." "What sort of accusations?" Miss Vance reached into her briefcase and pulled out another set of pages. The initial letters of 4 consecutive recipes in Chapter 4 spell out Orion, the name of a food writer who died last March. Orion Ames. He was working on a cookbook of his own when he died, and there are people who believe Mr. Danton may have borrowed some of his ideas. Wolfe set down the galley and leaned back in his chair. You believe someone is using this cookbook to make accusations of plagiarism against Mr. Danton? I believe someone is using it to make accusations, yes. But they're also using your name as a kind of seal of approval. If readers see that Nero Wolfe advised on the recipes, they'll assume the book is beyond reproach. It's a clever form of manipulation. Indeed, Wolfe's voice had taken on the flat tone he uses when someone has committed an offense against his person. Miss Vance, I assume you have a list of everyone who had access to these manuscript files? I do. She pulled out a typed sheet. 4 people besides myself, 2 copy editors, an assistant editor, and our production manager. But the changes appear to have been made at different times, using different methods. Some are handwritten corrections on hard copy, others are digital alterations. Wolfe glanced at me. Archie, call Fritz and tell him lunch will be at 1:30. Miss Vance, my fee is $50 a day plus expenses. I will require a retainer of $200 and complete access to your offices and staff. Agreed. She reached for her checkbook. There's one more thing. Yesterday, someone broke into our offices after hours. Nothing was taken, but several file cabinets were searched. I think whoever is doing this is looking for something specific. Or, Wolfe said, they were planting something specific. You will return this afternoon with a retainer and a complete list of everyone who has worked on this book. You will also bring me a copy of the late Mr. Ames's unfinished manuscript, if one exists. It does exist. Palatine holds an option on posthumous publication. Excellent. Wolfe opened the galley again. In the meantime, I will examine this apparatus and determine exactly what message our saboteur is trying to send. After Miss Vance left, I sat back in my chair and looked at Wolfe, who was already absorbed in the cookbook. So, I said, we're in the literary detective business now. We are in the business of protecting my name from unauthorized use, he replied without looking up. Someone has seen fit to employ it as seasoning for their accusations. I find that distasteful. You think there's more to this than cookbook sabotage? Wolfe turned a page and made a small sound of disgust. Archie, when someone goes to the trouble of embedding secret messages in recipes and breaking into offices to search files, they are not merely playing pranks. They are building towards something. The question is what? He closed the galley and looked at me directly. This afternoon, you will visit Palatine Press and interview everyone on Miss Vance's list. I want to know who among them has the skill to alter manuscripts so subtly, who has access to the files, and who might have reason to accuse Mr. Danton of plagiarism. And if I find our saboteur, then we will discover what they were really after. Because I suspect, Archie, that the cookbook is merely the beginning. Someone is using recipes to spell out accusations, and accusations, in my experience, are usually followed by demands. I picked up my hat from the rack in the hall, already mentally preparing for an afternoon of interviewing editors and production managers. It wasn't exactly the kind of case that gets your blood pumping, but when someone uses Nero Wolfe's name without permission, they've made it personal. And in our house, personal always gets interesting. The only question was whether we'd solve this before someone decided that embedded messages weren't enough and moved on to more direct forms of communication. In my experience, people who start with subtle sabotage rarely stop there. Palatine Press occupied 3 floors of a narrow building on East 42nd Street that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed natural light was bad for concentration. The lobby smelled of coffee, cigarettes, and the particular brand of anxiety that comes from missing deadlines, and the elevator made sounds that suggested it was held together by hope and editorial deadlines. Lila Vance met me on the 4th floor with a manila folder thick enough to stop a small caliber bullet and the promised retainer check. "I've arranged for you to speak with everyone on the list," she said, leading me through a maze of desks covered with manuscripts, galley proofs, and coffee cups that looked like they'd been there since the Coolidge administration. "I should warn you, though, they're not entirely happy about being questioned." "In my experience," I said, "innocent people rarely are." The first interview was with Martin Keyes, senior copy editor, a thin man with prematurely gray hair who was hunched over a typewriter, attacking the keys like they owed him money. When Lila introduced me, he looked up with the expression of a man who'd been interrupted during surgery. "Miss Vance, I have 17 manuscripts to get through this week, and now you want me to chat with a private detective about cookbook conspiracies. I want you to answer his questions so we can figure out who's been tampering with our publications," she replied crisply. Keyes gestured to a chair beside his desk and lit a cigarette without offering me one. "What do you want to know?" "Let's start with your access to the Danton manuscript. How many times have you worked on it?" 3 separate rounds of editing. First pass in March, second in April. Final cleanup last week. He took a long drag. "It's a standard cookbook, nothing special. Recipes for people who think cooking means opening a can. Did you notice anything unusual during those editing sessions?" "You mean besides the fact that half the recipes read like they were copied from other books?" He turned back to his typewriter. "Look, Mr. Goodwin, cookbook plagiarism is more common than honest politicians. Most authors borrow freely and hope nobody notices. Danton's no different. But someone did notice. Apparently, though why they dragged Nero Wolfe into it is beyond me." The assistant editor, Dorothy Marsh, was more forthcoming. She was surrounded by enough paper to start her own recycling center, but she looked up from a manuscript covered in red ink and smiled with genuine warmth. "Mr. Goodwin, Lila told me you were coming. This is so exciting. I've never been part of a real investigation." "It's not as glamorous as the movies make it look," I said. "Mostly it involves asking the same questions over and over until someone says something interesting." "Well, I'll try to be interesting." She closed the manuscript. "I worked on the Danton book twice. Once for content editing in April, and again for final review last week. I have to say, it's not his best work." "You've worked on his other books?" 3 of them. Rafe's usually very meticulous about his sources and acknowledgments. He keeps detailed notes about where each recipe comes from, who helped with testing, that sort of thing. This time, though, he seemed distracted. Distracted how? He missed 2 deadline meetings, which isn't like him. And when I asked about some inconsistencies in Chapter 4, the chapter that mentions Mr. Wolfe, he got defensive. Said he'd revised those recipes based on advice from a consulting chef, but he couldn't remember the chef's name. That was interesting. "Did you believe him?" "At the time, yes. Now," she shrugged. "Now I'm wondering if he was covering for something, or someone." The second copy editor, Ruth Sterling, provided the most intriguing detail. "I did notice something odd," she said when I asked about manuscript alterations. "Last week, when I was doing final proofing, I found a recipe that didn't match my earlier notes. It was for something called Orion's Revenge, a soup recipe that seemed completely out of place in a chapter about meat dishes. What happened to it? I flagged it for Lila, and she said it had been removed, but I never saw a revision notice, and I always get copies of revision notices. By the time I'd finished with the interviews, I had a clearer picture of the setup, but no obvious suspects. Everyone had access, everyone had opportunity, and everyone seemed genuinely puzzled by the alterations. I was heading for the elevator when I noticed something that made me stop cold. The building directory in the lobby listed Palatine Press on floors 4 through 6, but it also showed another tenant on the 3rd floor, Orion Ames Literary Services. The dead food writer had kept an office 1 floor below his alleged plagiarizer. That seemed like considerably more than coincidence. I took the stairs down to 3 and found a door marked with Ames's name and a "For Lease" sign. But when I tried the handle, it turned easily. The office was small, dusty, and filled with the kind of silence that comes from months of abandonment. But it wasn't empty. Someone had been there recently. There were fresh footprints in the dust and a desk drawer that had been left slightly open. I was examining the drawer when I heard footsteps in the hallway. I closed it quickly and moved to the window, pretending to admire the view of the air shaft. "Can I help you?" a voice said behind me. I turned to find Lila Vance standing in the doorway, looking considerably less composed than she had upstairs. "Just checking out the neighborhood," I said casually. "Interesting that Mr. Ames kept an office so close to Palatine." "Yes," she said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. "It was a coincidence." "Funny thing about coincidences," I said, moving toward the door. "In my line of work, they usually aren't." I returned to the brownstone just after 5, expecting to find Wolfe wrestling with a particularly stubborn orchid. Instead, I found him in his chair, staring at the galley-proof Miss Vance had left, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Anything?" I asked, tossing my hat onto the hall table. "Several things," he said without looking up. "But first, your report." I gave him the details of the Palatine interviews, including Dorothy Marsh's observations about Danton's unusual behavior and Ruth Sterling's discovery of the mysteriously vanishing Orion's Revenge recipe. When I mentioned finding Ames's office in the same building, Wolfe's eyebrows rose slightly. Indeed. And Miss Vance's reaction. She looked like someone who'd been caught with her hand in the cookie jar. Before Wolfe could respond, the doorbell chimed. I opened it to find a man who was unmistakably Rafe Danton. He was tall, with a shock of prematurely grey hair swept back in a dramatic wave, and he wore a pristine white chef's jacket that struck me as theatrical for a business call. "Nero Wolfe," he boomed, extending a hand that was surprisingly soft. "Rafe Danton, I understand you're investigating some rather unpleasant allegations concerning my new book." I led him to the office, where Wolfe looked up from the galley with his usual expression of mild disapproval at finding his sanctum invaded by a stranger. "Mr. Danton," Wolfe said, not inviting him to sit, "you appear to be distressed." "Distressed? I'm outraged." Danton's voice filled the room. "Someone is trying to sabotage my book, my reputation, this Orion business, the mention of your name. It's all malicious fabrication." Wolfe merely looked at him, his eyes like polished stones. The silence stretched until Danton, clearly uncomfortable, continued. "I assure you I had nothing to do with any of these changes. My manuscript was delivered clean. I've heard rumors about Orion Ames and his unfinished work, but I never saw it. Never borrowed from it." "An interesting choice of words, Mr. Danton," Wolfe said slowly. "You deny borrowing from work you claim never to have seen." Danton's face flushed. "It's a figure of speech. The point is, someone with a vendetta is using your name to legitimize their accusations." "And who might harbor such a vendetta?" "I've made rivals, certainly. Success breeds envy. But specific enough to do this? I can't imagine." Wolfe closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. "Mr. Danton, you may leave. Mr. Goodwin will be in touch should my investigation require further information." Danton blinked, clearly surprised by the abrupt dismissal. With a swish of his chef's jacket, he was gone. "Well," I said, "that was enlightening." He certainly protests with conviction. "Conviction, Archie, is often merely the absence of a better lie." Wolfe picked up the galley again. "The question remains, why my name?" "It is deliberate and audacious." Mr. Danton offered no satisfactory explanation for who would go to such lengths. "So what's next?" "Tomorrow you will return to that building and examine Mr. Ames's abandoned office more thoroughly. Tonight I will study his manuscript, which Miss Vance promised to Deliver someone is using recipes to spell out accusations, and accusations, in my experience, are usually followed by demands. The brownstone settled back into its accustomed quiet, but I knew better. Beneath the surface, the gears of Wolfe's mind had begun to turn, and our peaceful Tuesday was becoming a memory. Wednesday morning found Wolfe in his chair with 2 manuscripts spread before him like battle plans. The galley proof of Danton's The Hearth and the Knife occupied his left arm, while Orion Ames's unpublished The Gastronome's Compass claimed the right. Between them sat a cup of coffee that had gone cold while Wolfe performed his peculiar form of literary archaeology. "Instructive," he said, without looking up as I entered with my own coffee. Mr. Ames possessed what Mr. Danton conspicuously lacks, an original voice. These recipes are not merely instructions, Archie. They are essays in disguise, each dish a small meditation on flavor, history, and technique. And Danton's book? Competent plagiarism disguised as inspiration. At least 5 recipes in Chapter 4 bear the unmistakable fingerprints of Mr. Ames's unpublished work. Not direct copies, but the essential DNA is identical. Wolfe turned a page with the careful precision of a man handling evidence. Someone with access to both manuscripts recognized this theft and decided to expose it through coded accusations embedded in the galley proofs, using your name as a seal of approval for their accusations. Precisely. An audacious strategy that suggests our saboteur understands both the publishing process and the value of my reputation in matters of culinary authenticity. After breakfast, I returned to East 42nd Street with specific instructions to examine Ames's abandoned office more thoroughly. What I found there made the previous day's discoveries look like amateur hour. The office had been visited again overnight, but this time by someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. The desk drawers that had been casually searched before were now methodically emptied, their contents sorted into neat piles on the floor. More importantly, someone had left behind evidence of their work: a blue editorial pencil worn down to a stub and several sheets of Palatine Press letterhead with practice marks in the margins. I was photographing the handwriting samples when footsteps in the hallway announced another visitor. This time, it was a compact man in his 50s with the kind of precise movements that suggested he spent his days measuring margins and calculating print runs. "Conrad Fielding," he said, extending a hand that felt like it had spent considerable time handling type. "Palatine's production manager. Miss Vance asked me to retrieve some materials Mr. Ames may have left behind." "Funny thing about that," I said, gesturing to the methodically searched office. "Looks like someone beat you to it." Fielding's eyes swept the room with professional efficiency. "Indeed. Though I suspect they were looking for the wrong things." He moved to the corkboard where yesterday's constellation of pushpins had been rearranged into a different pattern. Mr. Ames had a fondness for puzzles. He used to leave coded messages for his assistants using various office supplies. "What kind of codes?" "Simple substitution ciphers, mostly. He'd use colored pins to represent letters, arrange them in patterns that spelled out instructions or deadlines." Fielding pointed to the current arrangement. "This spells Knife, probably a reference to Mr. Danton's book title." I studied the pins more carefully. Blue, red, and yellow arranged in a specific sequence that did indeed spell out the word when you knew the pattern. "You seem to know a lot about Mr. Ames's habits for someone who worked at a different company." "We weren't at different companies, Mr. Goodwin. I've been with Palatine for 15 years. Mr. Ames was one of our consulting editors until his death. We worked together on several projects. That was interesting news that Miss Vance had failed to mention. Including Mr. Danton's cookbook. Indirectly, Mr. Ames reviewed early drafts of several chapters and provided feedback on their originality." Fielding's smile was thin as paper. He had strong opinions about culinary plagiarism. Strong enough to embed coded accusations in galley proofs? "Mr. Ames was a traditionalist, Mr. Goodwin. He believed in direct confrontation, not anonymous sabotage. If he had accusations to make, he would have made them openly. Before I could respond, my attention was caught by something that made me reconsider everything I thought I knew about this case. Hidden behind the file cabinet, partially obscured by dust and shadow, was a small stack of Palatine Press proofing stamps, the kind used to mark manuscript pages during the editing process. One of them was still wet with blue ink. "Mr. Fielding," I said carefully, "as production manager, you'd have access to these proofing stamps, wouldn't you?" "Of course. They're standard equipment for tracking manuscript revisions." His voice remained steady, but I noticed his hand move unconsciously toward his vest pocket. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious about the editorial process. For instance, who has the authority to make last-minute changes to galley proofs after the editors have signed off? That would depend on the nature of the changes. Minor corrections, typos, formatting adjustments can be handled at the production level. Anything substantive requires editorial approval. And who determines what constitutes minor versus substantive?" Fielding's smile became even thinner. "In practice, the production manager. We're the last line of defense before the presses roll." I pocketed one of the proofing stamps while Fielding was examining the pushpin arrangement. "Tell me, Mr. Fielding, in your professional opinion, how difficult would it be for someone to alter acknowledgement pages and embed coded messages in recipe titles without the editors noticing? For someone with the right access and skills?" "Not difficult at all. The key would be making the changes look like standard editorial corrections rather than deliberate alterations. Someone like a production manager, for instance." "Someone exactly like a production manager." He turned to face me directly. "But you'd need more than access and skills, Mr. Goodwin. You'd need motive, and I had no reason to sabotage Mr. Danton's book." That evening, I returned to the brownstone to find Wolfe in conference with an unexpected visitor. Margot Ames sat in the red leather chair with the kind of controlled intensity that suggested she was accustomed to getting answers to difficult questions. She was tall, elegant, and possessed the same sharp intelligence that had apparently run in her family. "Mr. Goodwin," Wolfe said as I entered, "Miss Ames has been providing illuminating background on her late brother's relationship with Mr. Danton and Palatine Press." "Illuminating and disturbing," she added, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made you want to listen carefully. "Orion suspected for months that someone at Palatine was systematically stealing his unpublished work. He'd been building a case, documenting instances of plagiarism with the intention of taking legal action." "Against Mr. Danton specifically?" "Against Mr. Danton and others. Orion believed there was a network of culinary plagiarism operating within the publishing industry, with Palatine Press serving as a central clearinghouse for stolen recipes and techniques." Wolfe leaned forward slightly. "Did your brother share his suspicions with anyone at Palatine?" "He tried to. He approached Lila Vance several times with evidence of theft, but she dismissed his concerns as professional jealousy. He also spoke with Conrad Fielding, who promised to investigate, but never followed through. And now, months after his death, someone is using coded messages to make the same accusations he was preparing to make publicly." "Exactly. But they're also using your name, Mr. Wolfe, which suggests they want these accusations to be taken seriously by people who matter in the culinary world." I gave Wolfe my report on the day's discoveries, including Fielding's intimate knowledge of Ames's coding systems and his admission of having the access and skills necessary to alter the manuscripts. When I mentioned the wet proofing stamp, Wolfe's eyebrows rose slightly. "Mr. Fielding appears to be our most promising suspect," he said. "He had access, opportunity, and intimate knowledge of both Mr. Ames's methods and the production process. But we still lack clear motive." "Maybe the motive isn't what we think," I suggested. "Maybe Fielding isn't trying to expose the plagiarism. Maybe he's trying to cover it up by making the accusations look like the work of a crank." Wolfe considered this. "An intriguing possibility. By embedding, obviously, coded messages and using my name without permission, he could discredit the entire investigation as the work of someone with a vendetta. There's another possibility, Margot Ames said quietly. Orion told me he suspected someone at Palatine was not just stealing recipes, but actively facilitating the theft. Someone in a position to provide advance copies of manuscripts to authors like Danton. A production manager, for instance, would have access to all manuscripts in various stages of completion, Wolfe observed. He could easily provide advance copies to selected authors, allowing them to borrow ideas before the original works were published. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, but it was still incomplete. Someone at Palatine Press was playing a complex game involving plagiarism, coded messages, and deliberate sabotage. The question was whether they were trying to expose the truth or bury it deeper. "Miss Ames," Wolfe said, "I will need you to remain available for further consultation. Mr. Goodwin will arrange for you to examine the altered galley proofs tomorrow morning." "And Fielding?" I asked. "Mr. Fielding will be invited to join us for a more detailed discussion of his editorial practices, along with Miss Vance, Mr. Danton, and anyone else who has had access to these manuscripts." As Margot Ames prepared to leave, she turned back to Wolfe with a final observation. "My brother always said that the best recipes tell stories. I think someone is using his recipes to tell a story he never got the chance to finish." "Indeed," Wolfe replied. "And tomorrow, Miss Ames, we will discover whether that story ends with justice or merely with revenge." After she left, I settled into my chair and looked at Wolfe, who was staring at the two manuscripts with the expression of a man solving a particularly complex puzzle. "So what's the plan?" I asked. "Tomorrow, Archie, we gather our suspects and present them with the evidence. Someone in that group has been using my name to legitimize their accusations, and I intend to discover not only who, but why they felt such elaborate deception was necessary. And if they refuse to cooperate?" Wolfe's smile was thin as a knife blade. "Then we will demonstrate that in matters involving my reputation, cooperation is not optional." The brownstone settled into its evening quiet, but I could feel the tension building like pressure in a kettle. Tomorrow would bring answers, but I had the distinct feeling that some of those answers were going to surprise everyone involved, including Nero Wolfe. I don't often see Wolfe genuinely affronted. Annoyed, yes. That's his default state when dealing with the world's general incompetence. Perturbed, certainly, when someone serves him inferior coffee or interrupts his orchid schedule. But affronted is different. Affronted suggests that someone has committed a personal offense against the established order of his universe, and that kind of transgression tends to bring out the worst in him. Thursday morning provided just such an occasion. At 9:15, while Wolfe was upstairs communing with his cattle-yars, Fritz appeared in the office doorway with the expression of a man who had discovered vandals in his cathedral. His usual composure had been replaced by something approaching outrage, which in Fritz translates to a slight tightening around the eyes and a barely perceptible tremor in his voice. "Archie," he said, his accent more pronounced than usual, "someone has been in the kitchen." That got my attention. Fritz's kitchen is more sacred than most churches and considerably better defended. "What kind of someone?" "Someone who moved the grains of paradise in front of the allspice." His voice carried the kind of horror usually reserved for discussions of nuclear warfare. "And the mace, the lid was cross-threaded." In Fritz's world, that was tantamount to arson. I followed him to the kitchen where he pointed to the spice cabinet with the solemnity of a prosecutor presenting evidence. Sure enough, 2 jars had been moved from their appointed positions, and the mace lid showed signs of hasty replacement. "Anything else disturbed?" The cutting board was moved perhaps 2 inches to the left, and there are fingerprints on the copper pot that I polished yesterday evening. I examined the prints, which were too smudged to be useful, then checked the locks on both the front and back doors. Secure. The windows were locked from the inside. Either we'd been visited by a particularly fastidious ghost, or someone with a key had taken considerable liberties with our hospitality. When Wolfe descended at 11, Fritz was waiting in the office with a galley proof of Danton's cookbook in his hands. "Mr. Wolfe," he said without preamble, "this was not as you left it last night." Wolfe took the manuscript and examined it with the careful attention he usually reserved for rare orchids. After a moment, he lifted the top page to his nose and inhaled delicately. "Printer's dressing," he said, his voice flat with controlled anger. "Aniline-based ink with a distinctive metallic undertone. This page has been in contact with a Heidelberg press within the past 12 hours. "Meaning someone swapped a page from our copy with one fresh from Palatine's shop," I said. "Meaning someone with access to both our office and Palatine's printing equipment felt comfortable enough to enter this house and alter evidence in my presence." Wolfe set the page on his desk and studied it under his magnifying glass. "Observe the acknowledgements page, Archie. The spacing is subtly different from yesterday's version, and there's a faint blue mark in the lower margin." I leaned over to examine the mark. Barely visible, but unmistakably the kind of smudge left by an editorial pencil. The same blue as Fielding's pencil yesterday. Possibly. But more significantly, this represents a calculated insult to this household. Someone has violated the sanctity of my home to manipulate evidence in a case bearing my name. Fritz, still standing in the doorway, nodded grimly. "What are your instructions, Mr. Wolfe?" "The house is to be secured. The bolt will be used between visitors, and no one enters the kitchen for any reason. If anyone attempts unauthorized access to any part of this brownstone, you will sound the alarm immediately." After Fritz departed to implement these security measures, I settled into my chair and considered the implications. So we're dealing with someone bold enough to break into your house and skilled enough to do it without leaving obvious traces. Someone familiar with our routines and confident of their ability to manipulate evidence without detection. Wolfe leaned back in his chair. The question is whether this represents escalation or desperation. I spent the next hour on the phone, arranging our afternoon gathering and following up on yesterday's discoveries. A call to the building superintendent on East 42nd Street confirmed that someone from Palatine, a woman with auburn hair, had indeed arranged to have Orion Ames's office rekeyed the previous evening. A second call to Dorothy Marsh revealed that Rafe Danton had visited Palatine after hours, leaving with a rolled tube under his arm. "Busy night for our suspects," I reported to Wolfe. Lila Vance gets new keys to a dead man's office, Danton walks out with mysterious documents, and someone with editorial skills breaks into our house to swap manuscript pages. A coordinated effort, or competing interests attempting to control the same evidence, Wolfe mused. This afternoon's gathering should clarify which. At 2:30 sharp, our suspects began arriving like actors, assembling for the final act of a particularly complex drama. Lila Vance entered first, carrying her briefcase and wearing the expression of someone prepared for battle. She nodded politely but kept her distance from the others, choosing a chair that provided clear sight lines to both the door and Wolfe's desk. Conrad Fielding followed, moving with his usual precision but betraying nervousness in the way he constantly adjusted his tie and checked his watch. He carried a small leather portfolio and positioned himself where he could observe the others without being easily observed himself. Dorothy Marsh arrived, looking pale and anxious, clutching a manila folder like a lifeline. She took the chair farthest from Wolfe's desk and kept glancing toward the door as if calculating escape routes. Rafe Danton made his entrance in another pristine chef's jacket, but today his theatrical confidence seemed forced. He surveyed the assembled group with the wariness of a man who suspected he was walking into an ambush. Finally, Margot Ames arrived with quiet dignity, carrying a leather portfolio that suggested she came prepared with evidence of her own. She took her seat with calm assurance, the only person in the room who seemed genuinely comfortable with the proceedings. The office fell silent except for the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional rustle of clothing. The tension was thick enough to cut with one of Danton's knives, and I could see each suspect studying the others, trying to gauge who knew what and how much trouble they might be in. Wolfe let the silence stretch until it became almost unbearable, then spoke in the measured tones of a judge delivering sentence. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered to discuss a matter of considerable complexity. Someone among you has seen fit to violate the sanctity of my home, to alter evidence in a case bearing my name, and to embed coded accusations in a published manuscript without authorization." He paused, his gaze moving from face to face like a searchlight examining shadows. "Furthermore, this violation appears to be connected to a larger pattern of intellectual theft involving the late Mr. Orion Ames's unpublished work. Someone in this room has been playing a very dangerous game with other people's reputations and livelihoods." The silence that followed was pregnant with unspoken accusations and barely controlled fear. I watched each face carefully, noting the subtle tells that separate the guilty from the merely nervous. Danton was the first to break, his chef's bravado cracking under pressure. "Mr. Wolfe, I swear to you, I had nothing to do with altering those manuscripts or breaking into your house. Yes, I visited Palatine last night, but only to review photograph proofs for the book's layout." "And the tube you carried when you left?" Danton's face flushed. "Layout boards? Nothing more." "Mr. Fielding," Wolfe continued without acknowledging Danton's protests, "you had access to both the original manuscripts and the printing equipment necessary to create seamless alterations. You also possessed the editorial skills to embed coded messages without detection." Fielding shifted uncomfortably. "Access and skill don't constitute guilt, Mr. Wolfe. Half the publishing industry could have done what you're describing. But not half the publishing industry had motive to expose Mr. Danton's alleged plagiarism, while simultaneously discrediting that exposure through obviously coded accusations." The psychological pressure in the room was becoming unbearable. Dorothy Marsh looked like she was about to be sick, while Lila Vance maintained her professional composure with visible effort. Margot Ames alone seemed unaffected, watching the proceedings with the detached interest of someone observing a particularly complex chess match. "Miss Vance," Wolfe said, turning his attention to the managing editor, "you arranged to have Mr. Ames's office rekeyed last evening. A curious action for someone who claims to have had minimal contact with the deceased." "I was securing company property," she replied stiffly. "We couldn't allow unauthorized access to materials that might still be under contract. And yet unauthorized access appears to be exactly what occurred. Someone with intimate knowledge of both Mr. Ames's work and your editorial processes has been systematically manipulating manuscripts to serve their own purposes." The web of accusations and implications was tightening around our suspects like a noose. Someone in that room was responsible for the break-in, the manuscript alterations, and the unauthorized use of Wolfe's name. The question was whether they would confess voluntarily or force Wolfe to expose them through methodical deduction. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the office floor, I could see the strain beginning to tell on our assembled suspects. The psychological pressure was working exactly as Wolfe intended, creating an atmosphere where secrets became increasingly difficult to maintain and lies increasingly hard to sustain. The game was entering its final phase, and someone was about to discover that using Nero Wolfe's name without permission was a mistake that carried consequences far beyond simple embarrassment. The only question was who would break first, and whether their confession would reveal the whole truth or merely another layer of deception in an increasingly complex web of literary crime. The morning's piece ended with the dull thud of the Gazette hitting the linoleum. Fritz, who only abandons his kitchen for matters of state or soufflé, stood in the hallway holding the paper as if it had personally insulted him. "Archie," he said. "The paper. Page 3, left column, buried under a headline that sounded like a toast. The hearth receives a blessing. But the real fire was in the copy. We hear the incomparable Nero Wolfe offered quiet counsel on a handful of recipes for Rafe Danton's forthcoming volume, Chapter 4 in particular. A mutual admiration. You decide, I didn't decide. I brought it to Wolfe, who was installed at his desk, already reeling from the morning's disruption. He read the piece, grunted, and let the paper fall as if it had contaminated his office. Imbeciles, he muttered, which, for Wolfe, covers a lot of ground. Before I could offer a word of comfort, the phone rang. Lon Cohen, our man at the Gazette. Goodwin, tell Wolfe I tried to spike it. It didn't come from City Desk. A society stringer got it from an editorial source at Palatine. Specific, too. Wolfe's brows went up in a way that meant action, not just talk. Call Mr. Panzer, he said. Saul Panzer, the best operative in the city, arrived before Fritz could even refresh the coffee. Wolfe laid out the facts. We require eyes and quiet feet, Saul. First, who leaked the Wolfe story to the Gazette. Second, who entered this house yesterday and tampered with the galley. Saul gave a nod, the kind that means he's already halfway through the job. Names? Miss Vance and Mr. Fielding to start. Also Danton. Their movements, their contacts, their trash. Trash? Saul asked, eyebrow barely moving. Editors discard what they wish to forget, Wolfe replied. Production men discard what they have used. Saul nodded again. Use Fred if I need backup. Your discretion, Wolfe said. While Saul mapped his stakeouts, I headed to Palatine. The mood on the 4th floor was more tense than a meringue in a thunderstorm. Dorothy Marsh was at her desk, pale and anxious. Someone's been through my files, she whispered. My carbon copies are gone, all but one. She slipped me a thin onion skin sheet with Orion Ames's margin note. Title a cipher, name your thief. I tucked it away. Who else knew you kept carbons? Only Fielding, she said, eyes wide. He asked me last week to consolidate my notes in production. Fielding himself was up on 6, counting pages and looking as innocent as a wolf in sheep's clothing. Rough morning, I said, with the Gazette linking Wolfe to your book. That wasn't me, he snapped. I don't deal in gossip. You deal in access, I shot back. Where were you last night? At home. Ask my wife. He turned away, effectively ending the conversation. Downstairs, I checked Ames's old office. The place was gutted. The corkboard was bare, the pushpins gone, dust disturbed where a ledger had sat for years. The for-lease sign was ripped, and the desk's bottom drawer was splintered as if someone had run out of patience or time. Whatever evidence had been there, Ames's black book perhaps, was missing. Back at the brownstone, lunch was a study in tension. Wolfe barely touched Fritz's cassoulet, which was a warning sign all on its own. At 2, the bell rang. A hand-delivered envelope, a clipped Gazette article, a cross-threaded spice lid from our kitchen, and a strip from a proof sheet with a blue smudge. The note, typeset in house letters, read, Taste before you swallow. Wolfe examined the items. Hubris, he said, setting the spice lid on a clean sheet of paper. You want the police? I asked. No. The police arrest hands. I am hunting a mind about then, Saul called in. Danton met Fielding at a lunch counter, passed him a manila envelope. Also, the Gazette stringer says her source was a woman with auburn hair at Palatine's switchboard. But there is no switchboard, just Lila Vance at the front desk. Stay with Vance, I told him. Not long after, Lon Cohen called again. Palatine's legal just filed for a TRO against Margot Ames, trying to bar her from releasing her brother's notes. I relayed that to Wolfe, who pursed his lips. Desperation or a gambit to control timing? Then I took out Dorothy's onion skin. Ames's margin note said, Title is cipher, name your thief. The recipe's ingredients, caraway, onion, tallow, egg, muscat, spelled out CO2EM, but Wolfe shook his head. Not acrostic. Ames preferred rotational ciphers. The title? Orion's Revenge. Wolfe compared the sump typefaces. The original was Orion's Remembrance. The letter swap is the clue. Someone is altering the evidence as quickly as we find it. He straightened. We will lay bait. Archie, call each suspect and give them a different assertion about what evidence we possess. Danton will hear we have Ames's black book. Vance that Margot Ames is holding a press conference. Fielding that we've traced the blue smudge to his editorial stamp. Marsh that Wolfe will audit Palatine's editorial process. Margot that she is under suspicion for the coded messages. Margot won't like that, I warned. She will understand, Wolfe replied. At dusk, I made the calls. Danton stammered. Vance went quiet. Fielding chuckled without humor. Dorothy offered help. Margot cautioned me about where I pointed suspicion. By 9, a sedan idled across the street, and a man loitered near our stoop, eyes on the brownstone. Down the block, Saul blended with the shadows. The game was set. Inside, the house was sealed, the spice drawer locked. Wolfe returned to his chair, content as a general with the field prepared. The pressure was up. The next move would show which lie had hit its mark, and which suspect would crack first. In Wolfe's world, the intellectual net was closing, and the culprit was about to realize that using the great man's name carried a price beyond imagination. Friday morning brought the kind of silence that precedes either revelation or catastrophe. The brownstone felt like a theater between acts, with everyone waiting for the curtain to rise on whatever drama our carefully planted seeds had begun to sprout. Wolfe descended at 11 to find me cataloging Saul Panzer's overnight surveillance reports. Our bait had produced results. 3 separate visits to the building across from us, each time to coincide with the specific misinformation we'd fed to different suspects. Instructive, Wolfe said, settling into his chair with the measured precision of a conductor preparing for a complex symphony. Miss Vance arrived at 10:15, Mr. Fielding at 11:30, and a third party at midnight who remained unidentified but spent considerable time studying our windows. Saul got photos, I said, sliding the prints across his desk. The midnight visitor was Gus Malloy, freelance muscle who's worked for Danton before. Looks like our chef decided to scout the territory personally. Before Wolfe could respond, the phone rang. Saul's voice carried the satisfaction of a fisherman with a full net. The Gazette leak traces to Vance. Called the stringer from a payphone 2 blocks from Palatine, used a slightly disguised voice, and Fielding's trash was illuminating. Special blue ink cartridges, the kind used for high-speed proofing presses, plus a sliver of galley-proof with metallic sheen. I relayed this to Wolfe, who made a small sound of satisfaction. So Mr. Fielding provided the physical evidence of the page substitution, while Miss Vance attempted to control the narrative through strategic leaks. Both responses suggest guilt, but of different varieties. At 9:47, our theoretical surveillance became practical reality. The doorbell announced what appeared to be a delivery man. Stained uniform, clipboard, the works. But his eyes were too alert, his stance too ready, and his face belonged to Gus Malloy. "Package for Mr. Wolfe," he mumbled, trying to peer past me into the house. "Special delivery, needs to be signed for." "No package expected," I said, putting my foot firmly against the doorframe. "You've got the wrong address." Malloy pushed harder. "Says here, West 35th. It's urgent, confidential manuscript." Before the situation could escalate, Fritz appeared behind me with silent grace, a meat cleaver glinting innocently in his hand. He didn't speak, didn't threaten, just looked at Malloy with the expression of a man who took the security of his kitchen very seriously. Malloy's clipboard clattered to the ground. Sorry, wrong address," he stammered, backing away with undignified haste. I retrieved the fallen clipboard and examined the delivery slip. It was addressed to Nero Wolfe, Esquire, and listed the package as confidential manuscript, urgent return. Clever, but not clever enough. Mr. Danton's desperation is showing, Wolfe observed when I presented the evidence. Having been told we possess Mr. Ames's black book, he concludes that physical retrieval is preferable to legal exposure. Or maybe he's not as smart as we thought. Intelligence, Archie, is often indistinguishable from panic when viewed from sufficient distance. Wolfe studied the delivery slip with his magnifying glass. Note the typeface, Courier Elite, with a distinctive break in the capital R. The same defect appears in the anonymous note we received yesterday. He was right. Under magnification, both documents showed the identical damaged serif on every capital R, clear evidence that both had been produced on the same machine. Palatine's equipment. Almost certainly. Someone with access to their typesetting machinery is producing our anonymous correspondence. Wolfe set down the glass. Take this clipboard to Mr. Fielding. Tell him it was found on our stoop. Observe his reaction when confronted with evidence of his employer's desperation. I found Conrad Fielding in his 6th-floor office at Palatine, surrounded by the controlled chaos of a production schedule under pressure. He looked up from a phone conversation with a printer, his usual professional composure intact, but showing hairline cracks around the edges. "Mr. Fielding," I said, interrupting his call. "Found this on our stoop this morning. Thought you might recognize the handwriting." He took Malloy's clipboard, his eyes scanning the delivery slip. For just a moment, his professional mask slipped, revealing something that looked like fear mixed with resignation. "I've no idea what this is," he said. But his hand trembled, slightly as he slipped the clipboard into a desk drawer. Interesting. We had a rather persistent delivery man this morning. Claimed he had an urgent package for Mr. Wolfe, something about a confidential manuscript that needed to be returned. Tried to force his way in, actually. Fielding's throat worked as if he were swallowing something unpleasant. I wouldn't know anything about that. No. Well, speaking of manuscripts, Mr. Wolfe was quite intrigued by the specific blue ink on that altered acknowledgments page. He noted a rather distinctive metallic sheen, the kind that comes from high-speed proofing presses. Very specialized equipment. The color drained from Fielding's face. His hand moved unconsciously toward a small wastebasket beside his desk, then stopped as if he'd caught himself in the motion. "All our inks are standard," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Nothing special about them." "Really?" "Because the forensic analysis of the page that was swapped into our copy shows a very precise match for some discarded cartridges that turned up in your building's trash. Same metallic content, same dye composition. Quite a coincidence." Fielding pushed his chair back from the desk, his professional composure finally cracking. That's circumstantial at best. Dozens of people have access to those supplies. True, but not dozens of people have the specific knowledge of Mr. Ames's coding methods that would be necessary to embed those messages so seamlessly. And not dozens of people would know exactly which pages to alter to maximum effect. The psychological pressure was working exactly as Wolfe had intended. Fielding looked like a man caught between confession and complete denial, his usual precision replaced by the desperate calculations of someone running out of options. "Mr. Wolfe is assembling everyone tomorrow morning," I said, pressing the advantage. "He expects you to be there. And he expects you to bring the truth with you, Mr. Fielding. Because if you don't, he'll extract it anyway, and that process tends to be considerably less comfortable for everyone involved." I left him there, staring at the clipboard in his drawer as if it contained a ticking bomb. The web was tightening, and our production manager was beginning to understand that his carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare had made him the primary target of an even more sophisticated psychological campaign. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe examining the two manuscripts with renewed intensity. The galley proof of Danton's book lay open beside Ames's unpublished work, and he was making notes in his precise handwriting. "Fielding?" he asked, without looking up. Rattled. The clipboard hit him like a punch to the solar plexus. He's definitely our page swapper and probably our anonymous correspondent. But I'm not sure he's our mastermind. Nor am I. Mr. Fielding possesses the technical skills and access necessary for the physical alterations. But the psychological sophistication of this campaign suggests a more complex motivation than simple self-preservation. He closed both manuscripts and leaned back in his chair. Someone is using Mr. Fielding's guilt and desperation as weapons in a larger game. The question is whether that someone is among our known suspects, or whether we're dealing with a fourth party who has remained carefully hidden. The afternoon shadows were lengthening across the office floor, and I could feel the familiar tension that meant we were approaching the endgame. Tomorrow's gathering would bring answers, but I suspected some of those answers would surprise everyone involved, including Nero Wolfe. The psychological pressure had been applied with surgical precision, and the results were beginning to show. Someone in our circle of suspects was about to discover that using Nero Wolfe's name without permission was a mistake that carried consequences far beyond simple embarrassment. The only question was whether they would confess voluntarily or force Wolfe to demonstrate why his reputation for intellectual dominance was so richly deserved. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline silence that precedes either revelation or catastrophe. By 10 o'clock, Fritz had transformed the brownstone into what I privately call Wolfe's Theatre of Justice. Every surface polished to mirror brightness, every chair positioned with mathematical precision, and the office arranged to maximize both psychological pressure and intellectual clarity. Wolfe descended at 11, carrying himself with the deliberate authority of a judge who has already reviewed the evidence and found it sufficient. He surveyed the red leather chairs, made a minor adjustment to ensure proper sight lines, and settled behind his desk with two items before him, the altered galley proof and a manila folder containing what I knew to be specimen pages of editorial markings from each suspect. "They will arrive in ascending order of culpability," he announced, opening the folder with surgical precision. "Each will be given opportunity to explain their actions. Each will discover that opportunity is not the same as absolution." Dorothy Marsh entered first, pale and clutching her manila folder like a shield against whatever accusations might follow. She took the chair farthest from Wolfe's desk, her eyes darting nervously between the other empty seats and the exit. "Miss Marsh," Wolfe began without preamble, "your cooperation throughout this investigation has been exemplary. Your carbon copies provided crucial evidence. Your observations about Mr. Danton's unusual behavior were illuminating, and your general demeanor suggests someone genuinely surprised by the scope of this conspiracy." She relaxed slightly, though her hands continued to tremble around the folder's edges. "However," Wolfe continued, "your position as assistant editor provided access to both manuscripts and the knowledge necessary to identify the plagiarism. You will remain and observe, but in silence." Conrad Fielding arrived next, looking significantly less composed than his usual fastidious self. His tie was askew. His hands showed faint blue stains that suggested recent contact with editorial ink, and he carried a thin portfolio with edges frayed from nervous handling. "Mr. Fielding," Wolfe said as the production manager took his seat, "we have established that you possess both the technical skills and the access necessary to execute the physical alterations to these manuscripts. The blue ink analysis, the typewriter defects, and the proofing equipment all point to your direct involvement." Fielding's throat worked as if swallowing something unpleasant. I was trying to protect the publication schedule. The accusations would have destroyed everything. By accusations, you mean the entirely accurate charges of plagiarism against Mr. Danton's work? The book was already in production. Thousands of dollars invested. I thought if I could neutralize the coded messages, make them look like pranks rather than serious accusations. You thought to discredit legitimate accusations by making them appear obviously planted. Wolfe leaned forward slightly. A sophisticated strategy that required intimate knowledge of both Mr. Ames's methods and my reputation in culinary matters. Lila Vance entered with her professional composure intact, but showing hairline cracks around the edges. She chose a chair that provided clear sight lines to both the door and Wolfe's desk, her briefcase positioned defensively on her lap. "Miss Vance," Wolfe said, "your strategic leak to the Gazette represents an attempt to control the narrative by invoking my name without permission. Mr. Panzer traced the call to a payphone 2 blocks from your office." "I was attempting damage control," she replied stiffly. "The unauthorized use of your name in the manuscript threatened our entire publication schedule. A positive press mention seemed like appropriate countermeasure." "Countermeasure against what specifically?" Vance's professional mask slipped slightly. "Against the rumors. Orion had been making accusations for months, claiming systematic plagiarism. I thought if readers saw that Nero Wolfe had endorsed the work. You thought my reputation could be used as camouflage for intellectual theft." Rafe Danton made his entrance without his usual theatrical confidence, wearing an expensive but rumpled suit instead of his pristine chef's jacket. He avoided eye contact with the others, taking his seat with the resigned air of a man who knows his execution is scheduled for noon. "Mr. Danton," Wolfe said, "your plagiarism of Mr. Ames's unpublished work was systematic and comprehensive. 5 recipes in Chapter 4 bear the unmistakable fingerprints of his techniques, his voice, his innovative approaches to traditional dishes." Danton finally looked up, his face flushed with indignation mixed with fear. "I never saw Ames's manuscript. Any similarities are coincidental." "Pfui," Wolfe's hand flicked dismissively. "Mr. Danton, you hired Mr. Malloy to effect entry to this house under false pretenses. He attempted to retrieve what you imagined to be Mr. Ames's documentation of your theft. The attempt failed, but it demonstrated the length to which you were prepared to go to suppress evidence of your plagiarism." The chef's bravado crumbled entirely. "I was protecting my reputation. The accusations were going to destroy everything I'd built." Finally, Margot Ames entered with quiet dignity, carrying no briefcase or folder, just an air of calm expectation. She took her seat with composed assurance, the only person in the room who seemed genuinely prepared for whatever revelations might follow. "Miss Ames," Wolfe said, "your brother documented his suspicions meticulously. He kept what you described as a black book, detailed records of plagiarism instances he had identified within the publishing industry. He did. He was building a case, gathering evidence for legal action. He told me he had enough documentation to expose an entire network of intellectual theft centered around Palatine Press." Wolfe nodded slowly. "And this documentation disappeared after his death. Along with his office files, his personal notes, and several manuscripts he had been reviewing for authenticity. The office fell silent except for the ticking of the wall clock and the subtle sounds of 5 people attempting to control their breathing. Wolfe let the silence stretch until it became almost unbearable, then opened his manila folder and withdrew 5 sheets of paper. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I will now demonstrate something that has puzzled me throughout this investigation. Each of you has claimed innocence regarding the embedded coded messages, yet someone with intimate knowledge of editorial processes created those messages with professional precision." He arranged the papers on his desk with the care of a surgeon laying out instruments. "Yesterday, I obtained specimen pages of editorial markings from each of your files at Palatine. Editors, like cooks, leave distinctive signatures in their work, the angle of correction marks, the style of marginal notations, the particular symbols used for common instructions." Wolfe lifted his magnifying glass and positioned it over the altered acknowledgments page. "The blue smudge on this page is not random ink transfer. It is the tail end of a transpose mark, a specific editorial symbol used to indicate that two elements should change positions. He moved the glass to compare it with the specimen pages. The angle and pressure of this mark matches exactly with one hand in this room. The same hand that wrote the coded recipe titles, embedded the accusations, and orchestrated this entire campaign of intellectual justice disguised as sabotage. The psychological pressure had reached its breaking point. I watched each face carefully, noting the subtle tells that separate genuine surprise from carefully manufactured innocence. Fielding was sweating profusely, his hands clenched in his lap. Vance maintained her professional composure, but her breathing had become shallow and rapid. Danton looked like a man watching his world collapse in slow motion. Dorothy Marsh appeared genuinely bewildered by the technical discussion, and Margot Ames sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on Wolfe with the intensity of someone watching a master craftsman at work. The mastermind of this conspiracy, Wolfe continued, possessed several crucial qualifications: intimate knowledge of Mr. Ames's work and methods, understanding of editorial processes, sufficient to embed coded messages seamlessly, access to Palatine's facilities and personnel, and, most importantly, a motive that transcended simple exposure of plagiarism. He set down the magnifying glass and leaned back in his chair. Someone wanted not merely to reveal Mr. Danton's theft, but to create a psychological campaign that would destroy his reputation while implicating others in the conspiracy. Someone who understood that using my name would provide the accusations with unassailable credibility. The revelation was building like pressure in a kettle, and I could see that at least one person in the room knew exactly where it was heading. "Mr. Fielding," Wolfe said, "you provided the technical execution, the page substitutions, the proofing equipment, the physical alterations. But you lacked both the motive and the sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation that this campaign required." Fielding nodded miserably. "I was paid to make the changes, told it was to protect the book, to discredit false accusations. I never understood the full scope. Miss Vance, your press leaks were damage control, not orchestration. Mr. Danton, your plagiarism was the crime, not the conspiracy to expose it. Miss Marsh, your involvement was peripheral and unwitting." Wolfe's gaze settled on the final suspect with the finality of a judge delivering sentence. "Which brings us to the individual who possessed all the necessary qualifications, who had access to her brother's unpublished work and his documentation of plagiarism, who understood editorial processes through years of collaboration with Mr. Ames, and who had the strongest possible motive for ensuring that his intellectual thieves received appropriate punishment." The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. Everyone in the room was looking at Margot Ames, who continued to sit with perfect composure, her hands folded in her lap like someone waiting for a dinner invitation. "Miss Ames," Wolfe said quietly, "you orchestrated this entire conspiracy not merely to expose Mr. Danton's plagiarism, but to demonstrate the scope of intellectual theft that your brother had discovered before his death. You used Mr. Fielding's technical skills, Miss Vance's administrative authority, and my reputation to create an unassailable case for justice that the legal system had failed to provide." Margot Ames finally spoke, her voice calm and measured. "My brother spent the last months of his life documenting systematic theft of intellectual property. When he died, that documentation disappeared, and his thieves continued to profit from his work. The legal system proved inadequate to address crimes that left no physical evidence and no traditional victims. So you created your own system of justice. I created a demonstration. Mr. Danton's plagiarism was merely the most recent and egregious example. The coded messages, the psychological pressure, the careful orchestration, all of it was designed to show how easily intellectual theft could be exposed when the proper methods were applied." Wolfe nodded slowly, his expression suggesting something approaching professional admiration. An elaborate and sophisticated campaign that succeeded in exposing not only Mr. Danton's specific crimes, but the larger network of plagiarism that your brother had identified. Justice, Mr. Wolfe, sometimes requires more creativity than the law allows. The office settled into contemplative silence as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Margot Ames had orchestrated an intellectual campaign that used the legitimate grievances of a dead man to serve a larger purpose, demonstrating that systematic intellectual theft could be exposed and punished through methods that transcended traditional legal remedies. The question that remained was whether Wolfe would consider this elaborate deception a crime deserving punishment or a form of justice that merited his professional respect. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the office floor, I realized that our cookbook conspiracy had evolved into something considerably more complex than simple plagiarism. It had become a meditation on the nature of justice itself, and the lengths to which intelligent people will go to ensure that intellectual crimes receive appropriate consequences. Tomorrow would bring the final resolution, but I suspected that resolution would be unlike anything our previous cases had provided. When the victim becomes the prosecutor, and the prosecution becomes performance art, even Nero Wolfe must recalculate the traditional boundaries between crime and justice. The silence that followed Margot Ames's admission stretched like a taut wire, vibrating with implications that reached far beyond simple cookbook sabotage. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him, studying the assembled suspects with the measured patience of a master craftsman preparing to demonstrate his most complex technique. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty, "we have before us a conspiracy of remarkable sophistication, one that transcends simple plagiarism and ventures into the realm of intellectual justice, administered through psychological warfare." He opened the manila folder and withdrew several sheets of evidence, arranging them with surgical precision. First, the technical foundation. Mr. Fielding, your blue-stained fingers and the distinctive metallic sheen on the substituted acknowledgments page establish your role as the physical executor of manuscript alterations. The ink analysis reveals aniline-based compounds, consistent with Palatine's high-speed proofing presses, and the defective capital R on both the altered proofs and yesterday's anonymous note traces to the same Courier Elite typewriter in your production department. Fielding's face had gone ashen, his hands trembling as he stared at the evidence. I was told it was necessary to protect the publication schedule." "You were told what you needed to hear to overcome your conscience," Wolfe replied without sympathy. "Miss Vance, your strategic leak to the Gazette, traced by Mr. Panzer to a payphone 2 blocks from your office, represents damage control elevated to the level of conspiracy. You sought to legitimize stolen work by invoking my reputation without authorization." Lila Vance maintained her professional composure, but her breathing had become shallow and rapid. "I was attempting to contain a crisis that threatened our entire operation. Indeed, a crisis created by the systematic theft of intellectual property that you had chosen to ignore for the sake of publication schedules and profit margins." Wolfe turned his attention to Danton, whose theatrical confidence had evaporated entirely. "Mr. Danton, your plagiarism of Mr. Ames's unpublished work was neither accidental nor minimal. 5 recipes in Chapter 4 bear the unmistakable fingerprints of his techniques, his innovative approaches, his distinctive voice. More damning, your panic when confronted with exposure led you to hire Mr. Malloy for what can only be described as attempted burglary." The chef's protest died in his throat as Wolfe continued with relentless precision. "But the true architect of this elaborate campaign sits before us with remarkable composure." His gaze settled on Margot Ames, who met his stare with calm dignity. "Miss Ames, your brother's death left you with more than grief. It left you with meticulous documentation of systematic intellectual theft in a legal system inadequate to address crimes that leave no physical evidence." Margot nodded slowly. Orion spent months building a case against what he called the Cookbook cartel, a network of editors, publishers, and authors who collaborated to steal unpublished work from deceased or financially desperate writers. When he died, that documentation disappeared from official channels, but not from his personal file, which you inherited, along with something far more valuable: intimate knowledge of his working methods, his coding systems, and his unfinished manuscript. Wolfe lifted his magnifying glass and positioned it over the altered acknowledgments page. The embedded accusations, the acrostic recipe titles, the coded pushpin arrangements, the strategic alterations, these were not your innovations, Miss Ames. They were your brother's, prepared as evidence for the legal action he was planning before his death. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Dorothy Marsh gasped audibly, while Fielding looked as if he might be sick. Orion had embedded what he called intellectual time bombs in several manuscripts under review at Palatine, Margot explained, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. He knew that if his stolen work was published, the embedded evidence would eventually surface and expose not just individual plagiarism, but the entire network that facilitated it. Wolfe leaned forward, his interest clearly engaged. So when Mr. Danton's book approached publication, you activated your brother's dormant strategy. You manipulated Mr. Fielding through a combination of financial incentive and professional fear, convinced Miss Vance that damage control required strategic press manipulation, and used my reputation as a seal of authenticity for accusations that were entirely accurate. I provided Mr. Fielding with advance payment for what I described as editorial consulting, Margot admitted. His guilty conscience about his role in facilitating plagiarism made him susceptible to the suggestion that minor alterations could protect everyone involved. Miss Vance's concern for Palatine's reputation made her vulnerable to the idea that positive press coverage could counteract negative rumors. And the break into my house? I never provided Mr. Fielding with a key, Mr. Wolfe. I simply allowed him to believe I had the resources to obtain one. His desperation to retrieve what he imagined to be incriminating evidence led him to take actions I never explicitly requested. The psychological sophistication of the campaign was becoming clear. Margot had orchestrated a complex manipulation that used each participant's existing guilt, fear, or greed to achieve her objectives while maintaining her own technical innocence. The beauty of your strategy, Miss Ames, lay in its use of truth as a weapon. Every accusation embedded in the manuscript was factually accurate. Every piece of evidence pointed to genuine crimes. You simply ensured that the truth would be discovered through methods that would make it impossible to ignore or suppress. Wolfe closed the folder and surveyed the assembled suspects with judicial finality. The question that remains is not whether crimes were committed. They clearly were. But what form of justice is appropriate for crimes that traditional law enforcement is ill-equipped to address? He turned first to Danton. Mr. Danton, your career is built on stolen intellectual property. The public will soon understand that your celebrated innovations were appropriated from a dead man's unpublished work. Palatine Press will withdraw your book from publication, and you will publicly acknowledge the true source of your recipes. The alternative is prosecution for fraud and theft of intellectual property. Danton sagged in his chair, the fight gone out of him entirely. Mr. Fielding, your technical skills were subverted to serve criminal conspiracy, but your cooperation in exposing the larger network will be taken into account. You will provide complete documentation of your role in facilitating plagiarism, including financial records and correspondence. Your future employment in publishing will depend on your complete honesty in this matter. To Lila Vance, he offered a stark choice. Miss Vance, Palatine Press will issue a public apology for the unauthorized use of my name and acknowledge the editorial failures that allowed systematic plagiarism to flourish. The company will also pay substantial damages to Mr. Ames's estate and implement editorial safeguards to prevent future intellectual theft. The alternative is public exposure of Palatine's role as a clearinghouse for stolen literary property. Finally, he addressed Margot Ames directly. Miss Ames, your methods were technically illegal and undeniably manipulative. However, your objective was to expose systematic criminal activity that legitimate authorities had failed to address. You achieved justice through intellectual means rather than physical force, and you did so without seeking personal gain beyond the vindication of your brother's work. The office fell silent as everyone absorbed the weight of Wolfe's judgments. The psychological pressure that had dominated the room was finally dissipating, replaced by the recognition that consequences, both legal and moral, were inevitable. Justice, Miss Ames, is rarely served hot, Wolfe concluded. It requires patience, precision, and the courage to pursue truth even when traditional remedies prove inadequate. Your brother would have appreciated the elegance of your solution, even if he might have questioned the necessity of such elaborate deception. Margot stood with quiet dignity. Orion always said that the best recipes tell stories, Mr. Wolfe. I simply ensured that his story would be told, even if he couldn't tell it himself. As the gathering dispersed, each participant carrying the weight of their revealed actions and their assigned consequences, I realized that our cookbook conspiracy had evolved into something unprecedented in our experience. For the first time, Nero Wolfe had encountered a case where the criminal's methods matched his own intellectual sophistication, where justice had been achieved through psychological manipulation rather than legal process, and where the traditional boundaries between crime and punishment had been redrawn by necessity rather than preference. The brownstone settled back into its accustomed quiet, but the implications of what we had witnessed would linger long after the last suspect had departed. Intellectual crimes, as Margot Ames had demonstrated, sometimes required intellectual solutions, and sometimes the most effective justice was the kind that worked with human nature rather than against it. The cookbook conspiracy was over, but its lessons about the nature of justice, the inadequacy of traditional remedies for intellectual crimes, and the power of truth as a weapon would remain with us long after the final recipe had been served. Fritz appeared in the doorway as the last guest departed, carrying himself with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose kitchen had been restored to its proper sanctity. "Dinner, Mr. Wolfe." "In due course, Fritz." First, I believe, a moment of reflection on the curious relationship between appetite and justice. Both, it seems, are best served with proper seasoning and adequate time to develop their full flavor. The great man settled back in his chair, contemplating the complex recipe for justice that had just been served in his office. Like all of Fritz's finest dishes, it had required careful preparation, precise timing, and just the right combination of ingredients to achieve the desired result. And like all truly satisfying meals, it left everyone involved with a deeper appreciation for the skill required to transform raw materials into something approaching perfection. The brownstone on West 35th Street possesses a particular quality of silence that descends after intellectual combat has reached its conclusion. Not the empty quiet of abandonment, but the satisfied stillness of a precision instrument returning to rest. Sunday morning brought that familiar peace, accompanied by the methodical sounds of Fritz restoring order to his violated kingdom. I found him in the kitchen at 9, moving with the focused intensity of a man exorcising demons through the application of copper polish and morale indignation. The spice cabinet had been reorganized with military precision, each jar positioned according to some internal logic that would have made a Swiss clockmaker weep with envy. The grains of paradise stood at attention behind the allspice like disciplined soldiers, and the mace lid threaded with mechanical perfection. "The sanctity has been restored," Fritz announced without looking up from his work, "and I have taken the liberty of installing additional security measures. No more delivery men with elastic morals will disturb this household. By 10 o'clock, the outside world had begun to digest the implications of our case. Lon Cohen called with the satisfaction of a reporter who had been handed a story that wrote itself. The morning edition carried a piece that hit the publishing industry like a cleaver to the cutting board. Danton's The Hearth and the Knife was postponed indefinitely. Palatine Press was announcing a comprehensive editorial audit, and substantial restitution to the Ames estate was being negotiated. "They're calling it the Cookbook conspiracy," Lon reported with obvious relish. "And before you ask, I used Wolfe's name exactly once, to clarify that he never advised any cookbook and that any suggestion otherwise was the invention of overzealous staff members." Wolfe, who had descended earlier than usual and was already installed in his chair with the morning mail, grunted his approval. "Adequately seasoned," he observed. "The truth requires no embellishment when properly presented." The mail itself provided evidence of how quickly the publishing world had absorbed the lessons of our case. 3 separate publishers had written requesting Wolfe's services as a consulting editor for authenticity verification. A literary agent inquired about his availability for expert testimony in plagiarism cases. And Harrison Wolfe of Gourmet and Table magazine offered a position as consulting editor with the respectful acknowledgement that all work could be conducted from the brownstone without disrupting Wolfe's established routines. "The industry has discovered," Wolfe said, examining the correspondence, "that the aroma of scandal lingers longer than the odor of ink. They seek to inoculate themselves against future embarrassment through association with unimpeachable integrity." Before I could respond, the doorbell announced Conrad Fielding, looking considerably more composed than when we'd last seen him. He carried a thick manila envelope and wore the expression of a man who had decided that complete confession was his most viable path to redemption. "Mr. Wolfe," he said when I led him to the office, "I've brought everything you requested. Financial records, correspondence, a complete list of manuscripts I altered over the past 2 years, and documentation of the entire network that Miss Ames called the Cookbook Cartel." Wolfe accepted the envelope without opening it, but his slight nod indicated satisfaction. "Your cooperation is noted, Mr. Fielding. What are your intentions regarding future employment?" "I've resigned from Palatine. Miss Vance has agreed to provide a neutral reference acknowledging my technical skills while noting my ethical lapses. I'm hoping to find work with educational publishers, where the temptation to facilitate plagiarism would be considerably reduced." A sensible approach. The publishing industry requires individuals of uncompromising integrity. Your recent experience should serve as adequate reminder of the consequences when that integrity is compromised. After Fielding's departure, I examined his documentation while Wolfe absorbed himself in the correspondence from potential clients. The scope of the plagiarism network was staggering. Dozens of authors, hundreds of stolen recipes, and a systematic approach to intellectual theft that had operated for years with impunity. At noon, Dorothy Marsh arrived with a small wrapped package and the expression of someone who had survived a natural disaster with her integrity intact. She had been promoted to head a new department at Palatine, focused on intellectual property, verification, implementing systems to prevent future instances of plagiarism. "I wanted to thank you both," she said, presenting Wolfe with a first edition of Escoffier's Le Guide Culinaire. "This whole experience has been terrifying, but also educational. I've learned more about editorial ethics in the past week than in my entire previous career." Wolfe examined the book with obvious pleasure. "Miss Marsh, this is most thoughtful. Escoffier understood that culinary excellence requires not only skill and creativity, but absolute honesty about sources and influences. A lesson the contemporary publishing industry would do well to remember." The afternoon brought a steady stream of phone calls from reporters, attorneys, and publishers seeking comment on what the papers were calling the Cookbook conspiracy. I fielded most with standard responses about client confidentiality and intellectual property protection. But one call stood out from the district attorney's office, confirming that no charges would be filed against Margot Ames. The unusual circumstances and public service aspects of her actions, the assistant DA explained, make prosecution inadvisable. She exposed systematic criminal activity that legitimate authorities had failed to address. When I relayed this to Wolfe, he leaned back in his chair with something approaching satisfaction. Miss Ames achieved justice through methods that, while technically irregular, served the public interest more effectively than conventional legal remedies. The district attorney recognizes that prosecuting her would send an unfortunate message about the state's commitment to protecting intellectual property. As evening approached, Fritz appeared in the doorway with his usual impeccable timing. "Dinner is prepared, Mr. Wolfe. I've created a special menu in honor of our recent educational experience." In the dining room, we found a meal that was clearly Fritz's commentary on the case. Potage Orion, a soup based on a recipe from Ames's unpublished manuscript. Filet de bœuf à la vérité, beef prepared according to its authentic classical method, with no unauthorized modifications. And for dessert, tarte au secret révélé, a tart that Fritz claimed revealed its true ingredients only to those with the patience to analyze its construction properly. "Fritz," Wolfe said after tasting the soup, "this is exceptional. The balance of flavors suggests someone who understood the essential relationship between innovation and tradition." "Mr. Ames was a true craftsman," Fritz replied. "His recipes show respect for classical techniques, while introducing subtle improvements that enhance, rather than disguise, the fundamental character of each dish." As we finished dinner and returned to the office, I reflected on the unique nature of this case. We had encountered plagiarism before, and certainly conspiracy, but never a situation where the criminal's methods so closely paralleled Wolfe's own approach to problem-solving. Margot Ames had used psychological manipulation, careful orchestration, and intellectual superiority to achieve her objectives, the same tools Wolfe employed in every investigation. "You admire her, don't you?" I said as Wolfe settled into his chair with a snifter of cognac. "I admire her effectiveness, Archie." Miss Ames faced a problem that conventional solutions had failed to address, and she developed an unconventional solution that achieved her objectives while exposing a larger pattern of criminal activity. The methods were questionable, but the results were unambiguously beneficial. Even though she used your name without permission, she used my name to legitimize accurate accusations against genuine criminals. While I cannot approve of the deception, I must acknowledge that it served justice more effectively than legal proceedings might have done. Wolfe paused, swirling the cognac in his snifter with the careful attention he usually reserved for examining orchid specimens. "This case has demonstrated something significant about the evolutions of crime and justice in the modern world, Archie. Intellectual theft operates in shadows that traditional law enforcement is ill-equipped to illuminate. When conventional remedies prove inadequate, unconventional solutions become not merely acceptable, but necessary." He took a measured sip of cognac before continuing. "Miss Ames understood that in dealing with intellectual crimes, the most effective weapon is often truth itself, properly seasoned with psychological pressure and served at precisely the right temperature. She orchestrated a campaign that used the perpetrator's own guilt and desperation against them, achieving justice through intellectual means rather than legal procedure. So we're endorsing vigilante justice now. We are acknowledging that justice, like a complex sauce, sometimes requires ingredients and techniques that would be inappropriate in simpler preparations. Miss Ames did not seek personal gain beyond the vindication of her brother's work. She exposed systematic criminal activity and ensured that stolen intellectual property was returned to its rightful source. The methods were irregular, but the objective was unquestionably moral. The brownstone settled into its evening quiet, the familiar sounds of Fritz cleaning the kitchen providing a comforting counterpoint to our conversation. The case was closed, justice had been served with appropriate seasoning, and the publishing industry had learned a valuable lesson about the consequences of tolerating intellectual theft. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this case had changed something fundamental about our approach to justice. For the first time, we had encountered someone who used Wolfe's own methods with equal sophistication, and in the end, we had been forced to acknowledge that her approach was not only effective, but arguably more just than traditional legal remedies. "Archie," Wolfe said, setting down his snifter with finality, "this case has reminded me that appetite without ethics is gluttony, and technique without candor is forgery. It is the same whether the subject is veal or verbs. Miss Ames understood that fundamental truth, and she acted upon it with admirable precision." He stood, signaling the end of the day's intellectual labors. "Tomorrow will bring new cases, new challenges, and new opportunities to demonstrate that truth, properly prepared and served with appropriate timing, remains the most powerful weapon in the arsenal of justice." As Wolfe made his way to the elevator, I remained in my chair, contemplating the implications of what we had witnessed. The Cookbook conspiracy was over, but its lessons about the nature of justice, the inadequacy of traditional remedies for intellectual crimes, and the power of truth as a weapon would remain with us long after the final recipe had been served. In the kitchen, Fritz hummed quietly as he completed his evening routine, and the brownstone settled into the satisfied quiet of a job well done. The spice cabinet was secure. The sanctity was restored, and if truth was indeed a spice, as I had come to believe, then we had learned that sometimes a pinch was all you needed, but it had to be applied with precision, timing, and absolute commitment to the recipe for justice. The only question was whether our future clients would prove as intellectually sophisticated as Margot Ames, and whether we would be prepared for opponents who understood that the best way to challenge Nero Wolfe was to use his own methods with equal skill and determination. But that, as Fritz would say, was a recipe for another day. Monday morning settled on the brownstone like a well-pressed tablecloth, smooth and undisturbed. The domestic rhythms had reasserted themselves with the precision of a Swiss chronometer. Wolfe upstairs with his orchids from 9 to 11, Fritz humming contentedly in his restored kitchen, and me at my desk sorting through what had become a surprisingly voluminous correspondence. The first order of business was Saul Panzer's final report, delivered with his characteristic economy of words. "Backdoor cylinder shows minute scoring at the plug," he said over the phone. "Machined picks, not a key. Tool marks match a set Malloy's used before. Your trespasser was skilled but not intimate." I relayed this to Wolfe, who grunted his satisfaction. "Acceptable. A pick explains the restraint without implying complicity." In Wolfe's lexicon, that meant he preferred his enemies bold rather than betraying. By noon, the outside world had begun digesting the implications of our case. Palatine Press issued a formal statement withdrawing Danton's book, apologizing for the unauthorized use of Wolfe's name, and announcing a comprehensive editorial audit. The accompanying check for reputational damages was substantial enough to keep Fritz in truffles through several winters. Lon Cohen called with the satisfaction of a reporter handed a story that wrote itself. "They're calling it the Cookbook conspiracy," he reported. "Danton's issued a mea culpa, crediting Orion Ames by name. The DA's office is staying quiet, but 3 more publishers have admitted to editorial oversights involving posthumous plagiarism." At 2:30, the doorbell announced Margot Ames, carrying a leather-bound volume wrapped in brown paper. Inside was The Gastronome's Compass, the complete works of Orion Ames, published by a prestigious culinary house and dedicated to Nero Wolfe, whose unwitting participation in the cause of justice ensured that truth would be served with proper seasoning. Wolfe examined the book with obvious pleasure, turning pages with the careful attention he reserved for first-rate craftsmanship. "Exemplary," he murmured. pausing at a recipe for consommé Celestine that bore marginal notes in Ames's precise handwriting. The settlement with Orion's estate will fund a foundation for protecting deceased authors' intellectual property, Margot explained. Fielding has found work with a university press, where his technical skills are appreciated and his ethical education continues. Danton has retired to Vermont, where he cooks honest food under his own name. An hour later, Inspector Kramer arrived with unexpected news. "The DA wants me to thank you for that cookbook business," he said, settling into the red leather chair. "Officially, we're calling it a complex intellectual property dispute resolved through private negotiation. And unofficially, you exposed a federal case we'd been building for months." Danton was part of a 17-author network systematically stealing unpublished work from deceased writers. The whole operation collapsed when your case went public. Kramer opened a manila folder revealing surveillance photographs of Danton meeting with unknown men in restaurant parking lots. "The federal prosecutors want to know if you'd serve as a consulting expert on intellectual property crimes. They're creating a task force specifically for literary theft." The offer clearly intrigued Wolfe. The work would be conducted from this office? Entirely. Case files for analysis, written reports on psychological profiles and methods. No court appearances, no travel, no disruption to your routines. Plus, substantial compensation and the satisfaction of protecting authors who can no longer defend themselves. That evening, Fritz prepared a special dinner featuring dishes from Ames's newly published cookbook. The potage Celestine was revelatory, complex without being fussy, innovative without abandoning classical technique. The Canetono series achieved perfect balance between sweet and savory elements. "Mr. Ames was a master," Fritz observed. "His recipes show the same attention to truth and precision that you require in your investigations, Mr. Wolfe. Every ingredient serves a purpose, every technique has been tested, every instruction is honest about both possibilities and limitations." In the office afterward, Wolfe settled into his chair with coffee and contemplation. "This case has reminded me of a fundamental principle, Archie. Whether the subject is veal or verbs, excellence requires absolute honesty about sources and influences. Miss Ames understood this truth, and her brother's work will now receive the recognition it deserves." He paused, tasting his coffee with the careful attention he gave to all of life's pleasures. Intellectual crimes require intellectual solutions. Traditional investigative methods prove inadequate when evidence exists primarily in the realm of ideas rather than physical objects. The Federal Task Force offers the opportunity to apply our methods within legitimate legal frameworks. Plus, it would keep you busy between regular cases, I observed. Indeed. Though I suspect our clientele will expand to include authors, publishers, and other creative professionals seeking protection for their work. The brownstone settled into its evening quiet, but the atmosphere was charged with anticipation rather than simple contentment. The cookbook conspiracy had ended with justice properly served, but it had also opened new possibilities for applying our investigative methods to crimes that existed primarily in the realm of ideas. Fritz appeared in the doorway with his usual impeccable timing. "Will there be anything else this evening, Mr. Wolfe?" "Only this observation, Fritz. That truth, like a perfect sauce, requires the right ingredients combined with proper technique and absolute honesty about the process. Miss Ames understood that fundamental principle, and justice was served accordingly." As Wolfe made his way to the elevator, I remained in my chair, contemplating what we had witnessed and learned. The cookbook conspiracy was over, but its lessons about intellectual integrity would influence our future cases in ways we were only beginning to understand. The spice cabinet was secure, the sanctity restored, and if justice was indeed a dish best served with proper seasoning, then we had learned that sometimes the most effective recipes combined traditional ingredients with innovative techniques. The federal task force would provide new opportunities to demonstrate that truth, properly prepared and presented, remained the most powerful weapon in the arsenal of justice. The brownstone settled into satisfied silence, ready for whatever intellectual challenges tomorrow might bring. After all, as Fritz would undoubtedly observe, excellence in any field requires absolute integrity regarding sources, methods, and the eternal relationship between appetite and ethics.